It's B. Cameron Gain from the New Stack, and I'm here today at KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon in Barcelona with Alex Williams, founder and editor-in-chief of the New Stack. We're here today also as our guest with some of Kubernetes creators, original creators, and they are here. They include Tim Hockin from Google, Craig McLuckie from VMware, Gabe Monroy from Microsoft. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to be here.
And it's been 5 years. I mean, it's hard to believe, or almost 5 years, depending on when you define or determine the date. And taking a step back, where are we? And what are some of the main lessons you've learned during the past 5 years?
So we're here in Barcelona. We've got 8,000 of our best friends here talking about Kubernetes, which is mind-boggling. I'm looking at Craig. 5 years ago, you could never have predicted this. This is not something you plan for. The uptake has been phenomenal. In terms of lessons learned, you can't plan for this, but maybe we could have tried.
Yeah, I mean, it's been just humbling. I don't think any of us, when we were kind of getting this thing going, really anticipated that we'd be at an event like this in Europe with this type of participation. From my perspective, I think there's a few things that I would observe that, to Tim's point, you can't really plan for every sort of consumption model and approach that people will take to deploying and operating a technology like Kubernetes. I think that, and this is not so much a lesson learned. I think we had this thesis from the get-go, but it really played out, very well in practice, which is there's a tremendous amount of power in community. This project was not really about any one person or any one group, but really about creating an opportunity to bring together a very robust and engaged community that was built along a set of common ideals to create a positive outcome. And so, if there was a piece of advice for other projects, it's really like there is a lot of utility and efficiency in building an effective and engaged community around anything.
Yeah, and as someone who came from that early community, I actually was not a creator of the project, but I was probably one of the most engaged early community members when I was at Deis, and it was that value of the community that sort of brought me in. How welcoming it was. But I'd also say one of the lessons learned is the importance of sort of multi-vendor open source in terms of actual sort of corporate and end user adoption of this technology. I think that the story of Kubernetes likely would have played a lot differently had things like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation not been set up in the way that it was, and had some of the larger sort of corporate interests decided to sort of make big bets on the technology base. So I think it was both sort of the organic open source part of the community as well as sort of the corporate part that both were nailed, and now Kubernetes is sort of the second most popular open source project after Linux, really.
So I'd love to go back to around 2015 or so, and then into 2016. And by that time, Kubernetes had begun to accelerate, and Docker had still had its considerable acceleration in the market. And then there was a real shift in the market. What do you remember about that time, back in 2016, when there was essentially what you could argue was a split in the community? What is your lesson learned from that time period? Because it really created some isolation, I think.
So I had an interesting perspective on that, because at Deis at the time, we were actually running a very popular Heroku-style PaaS system that was platformed on top of all three of those orchestrators, which were kind of being evaluated at the time. And so we were one of the first in the community to make a very public bet on the Kubernetes APIs and sort of walk away from things like Docker Swarm.
Why did you walk away?
It came down to a couple of things. One was the machinery behind the community. It wasn't just that there was a community, it was that it was a well-oiled machine. The other element, I think, for us was and I'd argue that still today, this is a really important element of Kubernetes, the extensibility of Kubernetes. Kubernetes today has been able to flex to do things that no one who created it could have ever envisioned it doing. And I think we were starting to see that as sort of a platform builder on top of Kubernetes, and that really just swung the pendulum dramatically in that direction. I don't think we were alone in that.
2016 was right around the time we were really emphasizing extensibility and flexibility and custom resources, and all these things were really coming into being. And we had a lot of conversations with the other products, the other teams building Docker Swarm and Mesos and these other projects, and explaining to them you can use Kubernetes to do some of what you're doing, right? And you look at community. Kubernetes has thousands of developers. Can you really compete with thousands of developers in the long term, or should you instead be focusing on the things that are your value, right? The platform is not the value add of Docker. Docker has got an opinionated platform that people love to use. That's where the value is. It's really not in the orchestration. And I know we had a lot of conversations with all of these projects about, if we work together, it will be win-win, truly, truly win-win.
So what happened though? I mean, it didn't seem like that conversation really resonated very well.
Well, I think there were two competing views here, and you could look through a different lens, and either one has veracity. Either one is good. The one view is to think about the utility of vertical integration, right? So, hey, I want to create a perfectly curated, tuned experience for a specific outcome. An example of that is Apple does a great job of creating a vertically integrated, completely tuned experience, right? And I think that was very central to the Docker ethos. The thing that was really prioritized there, and they did a great job of this, and they unlocked tremendous value in the world. They popularized Linux application containers because they were so focused on this, which was really the developer experience, right? So they did a great job of code to container and creating a really accessible and usable toolchain. The other side of the house is to think about modularity and composability as your sort of core design ethos. And I think, in the OS world, Linux really embodies this. Linux shows up in everything from a cell phone to a mainframe and everything in between. And the sort of modularity and extensibility of a system leads to much more generic use. Now, when I think about the community and why it evolved around Kubernetes rather than Docker, I think it really comes down to that sense of, is the utility being driven by vertical integration, or is it being driven by modularity? Because Kubernetes was a far more intrinsically modular system, it enabled every vendor to look at it and see some way to create unique value. They could squint it and say, I could add this and it would create value. I could do that, it could create value. And as a result, it became a natural aggregation point for the entire community to rally around. Whereas because Docker was much more focused on that vertical integration and closed system experience, it just wasn't that interesting to a lot of the other vendors that wanted to bring resources and consume it. And I think at the heart of it, if you really dig into kind of what led to the success of the Kubernetes ecosystem, that's there. And then obviously, I think folks like Tim and a lot of the engineers built a really potent and open engineering community that really excited people and brought them to the table, and that was hugely useful as well.
And Gabe, would you concur?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were part of the group that was brought to the table by that engineering community. So, I do think that one of the fascinating things to me has been the scale test that has been applied to sort of the open source project in Kubernetes. I mean, and this covers everything from how do you structure governance around a project this large? How do you develop tools for collaboration around GitHub? For example, can you make GitHub flex to do the things that Kubernetes has needed it to do? And I think the community as a whole has acknowledge that these are big challenges and overcome them over and over again. Are things perfect? No, absolutely not. But I would say, given the size and the scale and the success that the community has seen to date, I'm fairly proud of what we've been able to achieve.
And Tim, I believe you mentioned this, or one of your colleagues as well, but it's been discussed how Kubernetes is not necessarily for everybody. And I was wondering if you could describe thresholds when an organization, or at what point they might consider adopting Kubernetes in terms of number of developers, for example.
And has that changed much since the beginning, I think? I'd be curious on that too.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about Kubernetes. We're at KubeCon, and I'm a little bit slanted on the topic, but it doesn't need to be everywhere. Not everybody has a need for what Kubernetes is offering. I don't think of it in terms of like, well, you're too small to use Kubernetes, or you're too big to use Kubernetes. I think of it more as, what are you going to get from it? What problems is it going to solve for you? And if you can't sort of enumerate the problems that you're having, you have a solution looking for a problem. And that's never a good thing when you have like a real business to run at the same time. So, I talk to a lot of startups, and they say, well, I only need 5 or 10 nodes in my cluster. Is it still appropriate to run Kubernetes? Yes, if you can tell me what you want to get out of it. And then we can talk about CI/CD, we can talk about developer velocity, we can talk about testing and environments and staging and all the goodness that people can get out of using a system like Kubernetes. But I also have conversations with companies who are doing their own thing, and they built their own platform, and their developers are happy, and they say, we want to switch to Kubernetes. And I have to tell them, like, I don't understand why you would do that. Why would you churn all of your developers when everybody's actually pretty happy with what they've got? Like, you don't have problems, don't go looking for solutions.
So Tim and Craig, you guys were at Google at the time when Kubernetes really came to be. Tell us about that time, for people who maybe, don't recall that very well. What were your jobs at the time? What group were you working in? What did you build Kubernetes from to get to that point? I'm just curious about that, the historical perspective that people might be interested in knowing about.
I mean, from my side, so my background, I was working at Google, and to sort of fully understand Kubernetes, from the Google lens, there was an incredibly powerful kind of union that happened. On the one side of the house, you had the Google Cloud Platform team. These were the folks that were chartered with building out Google's cloud portfolio. On the other side of the house, you had the Borg team. These are the folks that were chartered with running the infrastructure that powers the entirety of Google, right? I think, as with many things in Kubernetes, a lot of the early potency of the project was through the fusion that these two groups brought. On the cloud side of the house, we had technologies that we were able to bring to end users and customers and understood that segment. And on the Borg side of the house, these were people that really understood distributed systems development, right, at epic scale. And so, from my lens, I worked with my buddy Joe to build out Google Compute Engine, the infrastructure service offering. And we basically it was too little too late. Amazon had, from my perspective at least, achieved what I consider to be escape velocity in terms of just rallying a vendor ecosystem around a technology. And we knew that the only practical way to really drive the relevance of the compute platform we'd built was to introduce a significantly disruptive technology to the market and really look at the problem space quite differently. We didn't necessarily have to grab hold of and control this thing. What we really needed to do was just create a ubiquitous abstraction that we could run better than anyone else. And that really motivated, from our side of the house to stop soliciting. Now, obviously, we met Tim, and I think, in isolation, the project would probably not have become what it was because we were able to tap into, the potency of the Borg team. Do you want to kind of?
Sure. So at this point, I'd been at Google 10-ish years. And I was working in the Borg team, specifically focusing on the per node side of things, so what we call Borglet. And there was a big reorganization internally, and the cloud team and the infrastructure team were sort of smushed together, and we got smacked on the wrist and said, stop doing everything twice and talk to each other. And okay, I'd never really built products before. I'd always worked on infrastructure, and it's very different development experience, right? Like, I'll ship it when it's done. And if you have a problem with it, here's my phone number, right? And I can go out to all my Google developers and say, you will rebuild your program at this change list number because there was a bug prior to this, and everybody will say, okay. And so that sort of control is what I was used to, and these guys came in and they said, well, we want to build product. Like, we have experience building product, we know customers. And okay, it's interesting. we had been working on this project called Let Me Contain That For You, which was an open source offering of our internal container technology. Like literally take our internal code out of Borg, refactor it a little bit, publish it. And the goal wasn't to compete with something like Docker. We didn't even know Docker when we started this thing. Like, Docker was not a thing. The goal was to influence discussions with like the Linux kernel and convince them that we weren't actually insane, that the requirements we were asking them made sense in the context of containerization. We weren't getting a whole lot of traction with that without having real viable demonstrations. So that's where we were working on. And the Docker thing happened, and everybody went off and took a look at Docker and kind of went, it's interesting. Didn't really apply to Google. Like it wasn't going to help Google internally anything. But when we changed the conversation to, well, what if we were building Borg for everybody else, right? What if we could take Borg as a service and build that? Would that be exciting? We never did VMs inside Google. We just skipped that stage. We went straight to containers. And so all of the Google users had already realized the value of what we now talk about in Kubernetes, right? They were just used to it. It was just granted. Of course, you have automatic monitoring and logging and collection and sidecars and all of these things, and efficiency and isolation. And could we build that for everybody else? And that was such a exciting idea that we could go out and really literally change the world, that I couldn't not be part of it.
There was one observation. I don't know if you felt this, but there was so much kind of thought leadership and capabilities that were sort of homebrewed and baked. Creating opportunity for folks to actually showcase what they learned in the community lens, it must have been highly motivating. I don't know.
Absolutely. The ability to get out and talk about what we were doing at Google. Google, we publish papers, but we're still very secretive about the special sauce. And in fact, there were lots of internal conversations about, like, is this giving away the golden goose? What are the boundaries of engagement here? And we were able to work through all those things and convince people that this was going to happen, right? Like Docker, once Docker started snowballing and everybody could see that this was what was happening, this is going to happen. People are going to go from Docker's really cool on a machine to I have a bunch of machines and I need to manage them. And it's going to happen sort of with Google or without it. Let's be part of it. Let's bring our battle scars to the table and show people, don't do this, do this. And let's look into our crystal ball and try to build through that. To be able to get out and to come to conferences like this and talk to people about what we were working on was definitely a motivator, for sure.
So Gabe, I'd like to turn the question to you. You built the Kubernetes off based upon your understanding of Borg, right? That was how it was built, kind of with Borg in mind. Did you take components from Borg and then build them directly into Kubernetes?
Largely, no. Borg is millions and millions and millions of lines of C++ code that is highly entangled with the rest of Google. It is practically impossible to extract that literal code and use it somewhere else. Now,
so it was built from scratch then?
Borg was, or Kubernetes?
Kubernetes.
Yes, absolutely. It's not even in the same programming language. We had a very intense conversation about what programming language we should write Kubernetes in.
I remember Brennan started in Java, and we were like, nope, it's going to be Go.
The initial stuff was in Java, and I argued we should do it in C++ because we know C++ and we have gobs and gobs of Google libraries ready to use. Let's bring those out. Like many of them had already been open sourced in various forms. Like let's build on that. And in fact, I'd been working on the node agent for Omega, and we can just use this. Like let's get permission to just open source this and call it the kubelet. Let's start with that. And I think it was Joe who made the most cogent argument. Like C++ is not a great open source language. There's not a ton of great modern webby libraries for C++. We'd basically be doing it on our own. The barrier to entry is really high on C++ for new contributors. We really wanted to build a strong community. There's this Go language, and it's pretty cool, and it's pretty approachable, and why don't everybody just try to learn it? And we went off and we ran the Go tutorial, which takes about 2 hours. And at the end of 2 hours, I guess I know Go now. And
yeah. So it's a quick question for Gabe. So when you first came into the project, you first saw it, did it feel like a Google product, or did it feel like a product for customers in the overall market?
It felt like well-run open source projects. I think it was evident that there were Google engineers swarming all over. I think at the time it was primarily Google engineers, but no one was really leading with like, we work for Google, therefore, it was I think the speed with which the community was able to, and sort of the maintainers were able to adopt the right tone and sort of pick up the nuance of open source, which, by the way, is hard. I mean, it's tricky to go from building software internally to all of a sudden, now you're in the open source dealing with, potentially aggressive comments on pull requests and things like this. And so it felt very friendly and very open. And I remember folks like Tim and Brendan in particular just spending inordinate amounts of time churning through like the PR and issue queue, putting in thoughtful comments and replies. And, I would always think to myself, like, how much time and effort it must have taken, the maintainers to actually go through it and do that. But what ended up happening was that would actually set the stage for sort of the culture of the project, and the fact that kind of behavior was expected. So as other folks would enter into the project, engineers on my team or elsewhere, we were sort of taking that same tone and that respectful tone, and the thoughtfulness. And one of the other things that comes to mind is sort of how Kubernetes was able to pioneer things like pull requesting in documentation to describe a feature, so that we could have a discussion about what the feature would look like before any code was written on the feature. I had never seen anything like that before, and that was just something that I think smart engineers had come up with, and I don't think it was any sense of what company they worked for. I don't think that was really part of it.
If I can just add, I think, thank you. Those are very nice words. I think we brought some of the Google culture to this. Google's a very docs-heavy culture, very debate-heavy culture, where we like to argue about how things are going to look. And I think that works really well for infrastructure-y projects like this, where we can say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what it's going to look like, let's argue about it. And when we're done arguing about it, we will all smile and agree that this is what we're doing, and we will proceed. So it's like argue in the very best sense.
Yes, as someone who, I'm now safely outside of the Google mantle, I can say this. I don't think this project would necessarily have been possible at any other company. A lot of the character of the community was really indexed on the character of Google itself. It's naturally incredibly collegial, supportive environment to work in. It's apolitical. It's very engineering heavy.
Google is?
Google is, yeah. I mean, engineering dominated.
You'd argue maybe that's not so true as well.
No, I mean, that's just my perspective, having been on the project and worked there for 8 years. So, what I believe, and I've also worked at a lot of other companies, the character of Google carried forward into that community, and it became a very, a staple. Like when we started the project, we only had 7 engineers assigned to it full time, right? There were 27 Google engineers' fingerprints between the time when we announced the project and shipped it. It was a very collaborative, environment, and that character carried forwards into the community in a way that I think was, created a lot of sustenance. And I'm not saying that because I work at Google. Like I don't, right? But I think that was a very important part of the formation of the project.
I had 2 questions actually. On a cultural level, you talked about how we all know that Google was highly secretive to a great extent, and at the same time, you had to make the case that especially this platform should become very open and be part of the open source community, et cetera. And so at the same time, the second question is, was there after you decided to adopt Go as the programming language, was there an aha moment when you realized or you were able to accomplish what you wanted to do, and how did that happen? And please be as specific as possible.
Sure. So the last question first, because it's easier. I had an aha moment playing with Go when I had to write something that was, I remember very clearly, I had to write a program that was a UDP server, and I needed to do this for some test case or something. And it took me 8 lines of code to write a fully featured bidirectional UDP server. And I was like, this is amazing. This is, in C, this would be the scaffolding to get to main, right? And then I'd have to go dig out my Stevens book and remember how to open a UDP socket. And it was just 8 lines of Go. It was so dead obvious that this was a good language for this sort of work. And that was, you said specifically, that was my very specific aha moment that sticks in my brain. I don't even remember the test case anymore, but it was UDP, because it's always UDP. To the other question, or the other point, I guess, Google was really secretive about our infrastructure. And we published these papers, and a lot of them were sort of seminal in the industry, like MapReduce, right? And then we never followed up on them. And so we published MapReduce, and the world invented Hadoop, and then it became sort of a running joke, but not a joke, that when you come to Google and you're a Hadoop expert, we ask you to forget everything you know because we have something different. And it was it was an impact. Whenever somebody started at Google, it was 6 months of ramp up on an entirely new universe. And we didn't want to bring that into Kubernetes again. We didn't want to be hiring people who knew how to do an open source orchestration system and then say, yeah, we'll forget everything you know. We're doing it differently. So we were very clear that this was a place where the Hadoop MapReduce split could happen again if we didn't participate and really commit to participating.
I just have a quick question, if you don't mind. When I remember back at the TOC meeting at Open Source Leadership Summit, I think it was 2000, maybe the first one for the CNCF.
The one where this was the open source. This was in it was 4 years back, 2015. We announced Kubernetes 1.0 and the formation of CNCF at the OS. Oh, so this one that was at OSCON. Sorry, OS Leadership Summit. Go ahead.
Right, and there was a conscious decision not to focus on continuous delivery at the time, and I'm curious about that now. How do you think about that now? I mean, was continuous delivery just something was it the infrastructure need to be taken care of first necessarily, and then think about, because continuous delivery now has a much greater degree of importance in the community.
I think Craig touched on this before, which is that Kubernetes success is largely attributed to the fact that it did a really good job defining what it did well and what its scope and boundaries were, and it created space for the ecosystem to sort of build on top of that. And I think the conscious decision to not include tooling vertically integrated was key to that.
But going forward now over the next 5 years, how do you think the roots will be reflected in over the next 5 years of development?
Yeah.
I hope that when we're here in 2024, maybe back in Barcelona, what we're talking about is not actually that different. I don't think that Kubernetes will be radically different. I think it will be more mature, it will be more stable, it will be more robust, it will handle more use cases more gracefully, but I don't think that it will be a fundamentally different thing than it is today.
Yeah, I would hope that it needs to become boring, right? Like we need to stop talking about it and just have it as this perfectly consistent substrate that stitches together the world's compute. And if we all do our jobs right, it will enable an entirely new wave of innovation. And the stuff that we'll be talking about will not be Kubernetes. It'll be the next generation distributed systems that are built on Kubernetes.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the key to all of this, of course, is making sure that as an industry, we can repeat what we were able to do with Kubernetes and make sure that the next layer and the next set of systems that we are building on top of Kubernetes are also multi-vendor open source and welcoming to a very diverse set of open source contributors.
Great. That was the question I wanted to ask as well. Thanks for asking it.
Great.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.